Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our program today, which we hope you will find very informative. My name is Vivian Schiller. I'm Vice President and Executive Director of Aspen Digital. And our session today is very timely. Look, everybody that is on this webinar right now is laser focused on the last day of voting, as I like to call it. Not election day, because the elections are happening right now, but the last day of voting, and that is only 8 days away. But the close of voting and the decision from news organizations to call elections is only one piece of the puzzle. The days and weeks that follow next week are maybe even more important. We saw this play out in 2022. We certainly think there's a good chance we're going to see this play out in a big way this year as well. It is in those weeks when votes are counted, certified, and potentially challenged. With continuing threats to election officials and campaigns building up teams of lawyers to potentially contest results in court, it's really important right now to understand exactly the process that takes place between Election Day and Inauguration Day. In the past, that hasn't really been something most people have had to focus on. It's played out behind the scenes, but those days are gone. In today's webinar, we're going to talk about the role that election officials, the courts, state legislatures, electors, Congress, and the media play in ensuring the person that won the most electoral votes is the person who has their hand on the Bible on Inauguration Day. We have 5 amazing panelists with us here today. I'd first like to welcome Katie Harbath. Katie, who many of you know, probably has spent 10 years leading the public policy team at Facebook, now Meta, where she ran their work on global elections before founding Anchor Change in 2021. We are thrilled that Katie is now senior advisor to us at Aspen Digital for our AI and elections initiative. I'd also like to welcome Nicole Schneidman. Nicole is a technology policy strategist at Protect Democracy and an expert on technology and elections policy. Nicole and Katie are going to give us a short presentation about the promised 5 moments you need to know, and then we're going to bring on our full panel for a conversation and to take your questions as well. So Nicole and Katie, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Vivian. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So Nicole and I do want to walk you through 5 of these moments and set the stage for you a little bit. And we've got some slides here that we'll be able to show you. And I think the first thing is just that the information environment has changed quite a bit since we last had an election. According to the Bipartisan Policy Center, there have been over 9,000 bills introduced in the states, and 900 of those have passed around the administration of elections. Moreover, we are also seeing that Congress passed an update to the Electoral Count Reform Act in 2022. And one of those major dates in there that Nicole will talk about is December 11th, which is when the states have to issue what's called a certificate of ascertainment, and is a major milestone date that we will be looking at and talking a bit more about. Thirdly, we are also seeing, sorry, I gotta make sure I get the slides. There we go. Technology, it always works. County level officials in many battleground states are already trying to block the certification of ballots in many different places. None have succeeded yet, but this is a concern that we have going forward and something that could slow down this process of certification. And finally, there is the concern around violence and electoral violence during this period. According to a Public Affairs Council survey recently, 4 out of 10 Americans think there will be violence no matter who wins, with nearly 49% expecting it if Trump loses. And so this is a major component that we're looking at, not only what could happen at polling places, but harassment of election officials and poll workers and others who are going to be a big part of this process. But let me turn it over to Nicole to actually walk us through these 5 major moments.
Thanks, Katie. So I'm going to touch upon the 5 key dates that we want to make sure if you don't take anything else away from this conversation, please do try to remember these 5 dates. And we're going to start off with one that is hopefully familiar to folks. That is the one and only November 5th coming to all of us very soon. This is Election Day, and Election Day marks the last day when people can vote in person. And typically, while this varies across the states, it's also the last date by when mail-in ballots can be postmarked and then returned. Outside of voting, though, Election Day marks a really critical moment as it kicks off a series of steps by which ballots are first counted, then they are canvassed, and ultimately the results are certified, first at the county level and then ultimately at the state level. One thing to keep in mind is that the timeline for this process can vary quite a bit from state to state, but we do anticipate that first week and a half after Election Day is going to be a critical period because that is the duration when ballot tabulation will be concentrated. A couple things to keep in mind, as Katie already mentioned, we're top of mind for us is the threats that are facing some of these periods, and I wanted to call out a few. So a theme that I will be sharing over the course of reviewing these dates is to think about the threats and harassment that is facing people and processes and places that are core to election administration. In the context of ballot tabulation, we're really thinking about our election officials, as well as our poll workers and ballot tabulation sites. One thing also to keep in mind is this period right after Election Day is going to be high risk for confusion and potential misinformation as we are awaiting the results, particularly of the presidential election. So there could be the potential for red or blue mirages, as well as the potential conflicting calls by media outlets. And finally, we do anticipate seeing claims of election fraud that could be resulting from confusion regarding the counting of provisional ballots, the curing of mail-in ballots, or other key election administration processes. Next slide. Katie already previewed this all-important date that is new for all of us this year. So as Katie mentioned, in 2022, Congress passed the Electoral Count Reform Act, which was meant to shore up the process of counting electoral votes. December 11th is a new deadline. This is the first cycle where we have this deadline in place by when states must issue their certificates of ascertainment appointing their electoral slates. So it's really important to keep in mind this is a new deadline for all of us. We have seen a trend since 2020 where county officials are attempting to delay or refuse to certify election results. And so with that in mind, we wanted to call out the week prior to December 11th as potentially a high risk period where we may see again attempts by either county or state officials to refuse to certify election results. I do want to call out, and I have a feeling we're going to be digging into this as a team later, there are mechanisms in place to be able to resolve refusals to certify results, judicial proceedings that will be able to ensure that these happen in a timely manner. Next slide. On December 17th, we've got the convening of the Electoral College. So one fun fact is that the Electoral College actually convenes on a state-by-state basis. So the electors meet in their respective states, usually at a location that is designated under state law. Typically, this is state capitals. So we again want to think about some of the risks facing this point in the election process, thinking of our electors as well as our state capitals as potentially folks and places that will receive threats and harassment, as well as potential coercion. Next slide. Next up, we have a date that is familiar to many of us after what we all lived in 2021, and this is January 6th. So on January 3rd, the new Congress will be officially sworn in. And on January 6th, the joint session of Congress convenes, and this is when Congress meets to count and certify electoral votes. Again, I think we all learned the hard way from 2021 that this is another milestone that is high risk with the potential for threats or violence, certainly targeting members of Congress, as well as the Capitol. We also wanted to highlight that there may be confusion around Congress's role, as well as the role of the Vice President in counting electoral votes. Last, there is the potential for either parliamentary action or inaction by particular congressmen that is used to attempt to interfere with Congress being able to successfully certify the electoral vote. Next slide. And last but certainly not least, there is inauguration, January 20th, 2025. And one thing we wanted to make sure folks take away from this is that the process of electing and transferring of power to a new president and vice president-elect is not complete until Inauguration Day, specifically the public swearing in of our president and vice president-elect at noon on the National Mall. And again, in terms of risk that we anticipate this point in the election calendar facing, there is certainly the risk for protests, threats, or harassment facing those who are participating in the ceremony itself, as well as the potential for violence. And just to add in a new twist, we have seen that the weather has been pretty crazy of late, and we did want to flag there is the potential for even weather impacting the ability to successfully swear in publicly our president and vice president-elect. Next slide. So that was a lot to throw at you, and we want to keep that in mind. We put together this calendar that hopefully helps to illuminate what these 5 key dates on the election calendar are between now and Inauguration Day. We've also highlighted in a friendly red what we believe to be the highest risk periods facing the remainder of election administration. One thing that I want to make sure to emphasize that if you don't take anything else away from this conversation, I really hope that all of us who are working to ensure that the remainder of the cycle is administered in a free and fair manner take to heart that we've got to see this thing all the way through. Our job is not done until January 20th, 2025. Thank you.
So with that, Vivian, we'll kick it up back over to you.
All right. Fantastic. Okay, so now we're all experts on the 5 moments and why they matter. And with that, we're going to bring on our full panel. So Nicole and Katie, you're staying with us, I hope. But let me also introduce Gowri Ramachandran. She is the Director of Elections and Security at the Brennan Center's Election and Government Program and an expert on issues including election security, election administration, and combating election disinformation. Nate Persily is the McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. He is one of the most widely cited legal scholars in the field of election law, and for very good reason, as you will see. And finally, Kim Wyman, who was previously the Republican Secretary of State for the state of Washington. She has also served since then as Senior Election Security Advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, and is currently a Senior Fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. All right, so I'm gonna ask the panel a bunch of questions, but for those of you that are watching, we will come to your questions later. You should see a Q&A tool on the bottom of your screen, and you can answer your questions there, and we will get to those a little bit later, but you can drop them in anytime now. All right, Kim, I'm going to start with you. So you have been in the shoes, literally you wore the shoes of a state election official. So put us in the, tell us what officials what you would have been doing at this stage and to prepare for these dates. If you were a Secretary of State, what are you most worried about right now?
Well, right now, election officials across the country are focusing on making sure that people can vote early, that mail-in and absentee ballots can be received and processed, that voters that are eligible have the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. And so that's what they're doing. And since we are in an active voting period with early voting and absentee and mail-in voting, we also are seeing possibly mistakes that are made. It might be that a voter receives the wrong ballot style and they're missing the right legislative district that they should be voting on or congressional race. So those types of errors that come up are being dealt with. And the nice thing about having such a long early voting period is that election officials have a lot of time to be able to correct those errors before the polls close on election day. And I think what really is the focus of most election officials across the country really is the safety and security of not only those officials running the election, but voters who are trying to participate. The voter who wants to drop off their ballot at a drop box or wants to go into an early voting center. And we certainly have started to see some activity that would indicate we might have some potential violence or people in trying to intimidate voters. And so I think it's a heightened awareness and security of that, but realize that election officials have spent the last 4 years preparing for this moment. They're ready. Election officials at the state level are communicating with election officials at the local level who actually conduct the election, and they're ready. And we're gonna see how it all turns out on December, I don't know, something.
whatever it's going to be. January 20th, at least at the latest. So Kim, just one follow-up question. So one thing I think that was caused a lot of consternation when as the results were coming in 4 years ago, when there was particularly so much mail-in voting because we were in peak pandemic at the time, is different states just to have different rules about when they can count those early votes, which results in this red or blue mirage. So just say a word about that.
Absolutely. I think there is this myth that has come out of the 2020 election that we used to know election night who won. And I want to be clear, we've never known who won the election on election night because election officials spend the days, which we're going to talk about, after election, doing all of the canvassing and certification. And we have a handful of states who have a postmark cutoff, like Washington State, for mail-in ballots. And as long as they are received by election officials in time to certify the election, those ballots can be counted as long as that election postmark is on or before election day. And so that's one thing that will delay election results just because of the ballots that are being returned during the Wednesday and Thursday and Friday of election week in particular. And then the second kind of element to that is that some states like Pennsylvania have laws on the books where they cannot begin pre-processing, what election officials call pre-processing of ballots before election day. And that's things like checking the signature on the envelope to make sure it matches the voter. So all of these things take time. And, you're going to see results coming in that week after election that are valid votes cast by eligible voters that are still needing to be added to the count.
Right. So certainly in the case of Pennsylvania, which is such a crucial state this year, we will not. There's no way, if they can't even start processing those ballots till the polls close, it's going to be a delay till we know what's really going on there, given the high level of mail-in voting. Nate, I'm gonna turn it to you. So talk to us about where the greatest risks are and help us understand how real these risks are. For example, if the state legislators decide to certify results for political reasons in either direction that differ from what the public perceives, rightly or wrongly, what mechanisms exist to address those discrepancies and ensure a fair process?
Right. Let me start by trying to calm everyone down a little bit, which is that in all likelihood, right, the voters are going to determine this election. There are processes in place to deal with controversies. The election officials in the battleground states have been red teaming and preparing for this election for months, if not years. And so that while we all live in the shadow of January 6th, and we see that as this kind of defining moment in terms of the degradation of norms against political violence. Most elections are not razor thin, and even though the polls show it right now, there's the possibility that we, could know a victor relatively early. That being said, we should all be prepared for the likelihood, given what the polls say, that we won't know for many days, and that there is always the chance of litigation or other kinds of issues. And so I just want to start there. Now, the scenario that you paint of state legislatures sending slates of electors to Congress is one that was contemplated by the Electoral Count Reform Act, and that is one of the things that they tried to sort of put to the side as not a legitimate process. So the Constitution says each state shall, in a manner determined by the legislature thereof, appoint a number of electors. And so the state legislatures do have a very important role to play. But the Electoral Count Reform Act says that any changes in the laws with respect to appointing electors have to be done before Election Day. And so at least under the new federal law, the governor is actually in a very important position because the governor or the chief executive of the state that is in charge with sort of delivering what's known as the certificate of ascertainment, that must be done on December 11th, subject to judicial review over the following 6 days. And so the ECRA, the Electoral Count Reform Act, was specifically contemplating your scenario where the state legislatures can't just simply overturn an election. Now, having said all that, of course, ultimately, Congress is the body that adjudicates electoral controversies, if there are any. The Electoral Count Reform Act makes clear that the vice president's role is ministerial, so that Kamala Harris would not be. No one would expect her, as people somehow expected Mike Pence, to overturn election results. But you need 20% of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate to sort of lodge an objection with respect to any of the electoral slates. So the EC, we are in a much better position today in terms of federal law clarifying what are the kind of worst case scenarios of the type that you depict. So that's with respect to that particular one. But I don't know if you wanted me to talk about
I want to just dig a layer deeper here. And I'm going to,
Yeah.
I take your comments to heart. And I've heard you say before that there's this, it's all going to work out. And the person who actually earned the most electoral votes properly will be in the White House. But I just want to, even in everything you described, help me understand why if I have a politicized slate in a state, if I have a like-minded governor or chief executive of that state, and I have a Congress, 20% doesn't seem like a terribly high bar these days. Help me understand why those three hurdles could not easily be met in certain states.
Well, first of all, we need to look at who these people actually are this time. And so I don't want to like put too fine a point on it, but if the scenario that people are often pointing to is the idea that a Republican governor in a state will deliver a certificate of ascertainment contra the votes that were cast in that state, that is very unlikely in of the 7 battleground states that people identify. Only Nevada and Georgia have Republican governors. Now, it could go in the other direction, right? It could be a situation where you could have a Democratic governor that would be, just delivering a slate for Kamala Harris, and the situation that would lead to that would be one where there is chaos or there is litigation, and there's an argument that the election wasn't fair. But each one of the states has rules about what the governors can do, right? And there's a process in each state to determine who has won the elections. There's certifications that happen at the local level, they go up to the state level. And so, yeah, there's always a chance that whether it's at Congress or in the states, that there could be ultra vires kind of actions by these officials. But as best as it can, the legal context is constraining that possibility for them to act as sort of totally off the rails here. And so there is just a process in place. Now, look, just to backtrack, one of the things that saved us in the 2020 election was that in order for the election result to be changed, more than one state had to be flipped, right? So that the heterogeneity of the election conspiracies that were brought into court sort of looked like throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what stuck because and so the courts could easily dismiss them. If we are in a situation which is like Bush versus Gore, where you've got one state and it's one type of issue, let's say mail ballots or provisional ballots, then we are in a much more fragile situation than we were in 2020. And I don't see sort of the parties relenting and conceding to whatever the Supreme Court says, as they did 24 years ago. And so that is the nightmare scenario. But I think that we are way, far away from that right now. It's very hard to predict that that's where the world that we're going to be in.
But from your lips, Nate, from your lips. Gowri, I want to turn to you. A lot of this is about public perception. Yes, there are safeguards, there are laws, there are courts, there are rules. All that is great. But people are going to feel what they're going to want to feel, irrespective of the facts. So I want to just talk a little bit about that with you for a minute. First of all, we talked about Katie, or Kim referenced, and both of them, these sort of halcyon days where, we went to sleep on as if there were ever halcyon days on, the last day voting on election day, and we knew who was going to be the president because we heard news organizations call the races. Now, help everybody here that's watching today understand, what does it mean when a news organization calls a race? What is that based on? And also, do we imagine a scenario, or I guess I'm hypothesizing that I can imagine a scenario whereby different news organizations might call the races differently, even pulling from the same preliminary data?
Thank you so much for that question. So really, on election night or maybe a day later or 2 days later, when a news organization calls a state for one of the candidates for president or calls a congressional race for a candidate for Congress, right? The House of Representatives might be, the control of that chamber might be quite close this year. When that happens, they are predicting what the official results are going to be based on a combination of the unofficial results that the election officials have provided to the public, often posted on their website or uploaded on an election results reporting page. They're predicting based on those publicly revealed results and certain other information they have about the demographics and the political affiliations and things like that of the different precincts and the different counties in the state. So that's why it might just take one news organization a lot longer to predict one state than another, even if a lot of the results are in. Obviously, how close the race looks like it is going to be a factor that determines how quickly they're going to call it. But even when they do call it, it's still just a prediction because those are only the unofficial results. There's other things that need to happen in that post-election period. For instance, in the states, like Secretary Wyman mentioned, that permit ballots to be counted if they're received but postmarked by election day, but received after. Those things need to be counted. Many states have a notice and cure option where if there's something wrong with somebody's mail ballot, like the signature doesn't seem like it matches the signature on file, there's a few days in which that voter can come in and fix the problem. And a lot of times it does really fix an innocent problem, like two spouses switched envelopes with each other, or somebody has been getting older and their signature's getting shaky and a little messy. They can come in and say, yeah, that's me, and re-sign that envelope. So all those things have to happen. Provisional ballots have to be adjudicated as to whether the person was an eligible voter or not. All that has to happen. Reconciliation has to happen. That's a process where the election officials, at something that's usually called the canvass, we'll take a look at how many people actually got credit for voting. So we checked off that their mail ballot was received, or we checked off that they came to the polling place and they voted, that sort of thing. Let's compare that to the number of votes we actually got, right? And the number of ballots we actually got, and make sure that it matches up. Occasionally you'll have a tiny little discrepancy, like someone checks in at the polling place, their kid has an emergency at school and they run out and they never vote, right? So you're like one off. But sometimes people do find, wait, we forgot to count that whole box of ballots and there's 500 ballots in there. You got to then scan those, of course, and fix that. So all of that has to happen before the canvass is completed and you have the official results, and then those get certified typically at the county level.
Yeah, so thanks for laying that out. And I think you made a very important point at the top and then gave ample evidence for it, which is news organizations have no electoral authority. They are using their best guess, a lot of it based on results, but to call elections, we see a lot of caution. And we may remember 4 years ago, those calls actually affect the national psyche in many ways, which can also affect the way people respond and whether they're going to protest and whether there's going to be violence. So, for instance, 4 years ago, we remember that Fox, I think they were the first to call Arizona, which was a swing state, for Biden, much to the consternation of the Trump camp. It seems possible, more than possible, that this year we may see more politicized calling of states, maybe not based on, full information. Do you have concerns about sort of what chaos that might throw into the mix if you have one news organization calling it for one candidate and another for the other?
I do have concerns if that happens, although I'm not too concerned about the major news outlets having sort of huge discrepancies in the calls they make. They typically don't. What you pointed to from 4 years ago, where Fox News maybe called Arizona a few days sooner than some of the other news desks were able to, that's not really a case of one news organization says it went to Trump and one says it went to Biden.
No, it wasn't.
Right?
It was not. Right.
It's just a difference in sort of their level of confidence and their statistical confidence in making that prediction. So I don't particularly have any reason to believe that the major news outlets are going to, really conflict with each other in this way. And one thing I'll note is that we actually had a candidate claiming victory in 2020, far before there was any real reason to make that prediction. And the major news outlets reported well on that issue, in my opinion. That was a real success where they did not just say, okay, I guess that candidate has some information we don't have. They treated it as if it was still undecided. And that really helped, I think, with the national psyche. I do think there's a concern that some of these more kind of very politicized and not mainstream news outlets might make some suspicious calls. But I think, yeah, so that's really goes to the nature of people getting their media from different sources now and that sort of thing. That is an increased concern, but I'm not too worried about the major news outlets.
Good. I love the confidence on this panel. That's fantastic. Nicole, I'm going to turn to you. And we're going to continue on the theme of sort of public perception. What are in the event, and in all likelihood, there will be all kinds of narratives that are flying around in the days after the elections about what's happening, what's not happening, who's winning, all kinds of shenanigans. What, in your views, are the best strategies for media, for government, for civil society to counter these false narratives, to try to interrupt any kind of disruptions? Well, either on election, the last day of elections, entirely, when there might be some rumors about things that are happening at voting places, and also post the close of voting.
Thank you for that question. I think, we anticipate and are already seeing narratives related to misinformation emerging, right? Like this is happening. Certainly the narratives around non-citizen voting is probably the poster child of this right now. And we think that this is laying the foundation for narratives to continue to emerge in the wake of Election Day. So a couple things that are top of mind. I think one, encouraging every American to know who your local election official is. If you had to pick someone who is your authoritative go-to source for what is happening on the ground in your community, it should be your local election official. And I commend our election official community. They are going over and beyond to try to make sure that people have accurate, up-to-date information virtually in real time about exactly how voting is going right now. We are seeing this across the country, particularly folks like, for example, in Maricopa County in Arizona. I'm watching Stephen Richter give real-time updates on how pre-processing is already going of mail-in ballots. So I commend our election official community. And if we had to pick an information source, I would say your local election officials. In addition to that, I think that one thing that all of us who are part of trying to protect the fairness of this election can do is continue to shed light on exactly what election administration entails after Election Day. So I'll throw myself a little bit under the bus here. Until I started working at Protect Democracy, I was not well versed on the intricacies that are involved in election administration after Election Day. I was absolutely one of those people that, all right, media called the race. I can maybe go to bed for the first time in several weeks and become a human being again. I would really encourage, though, all of us who are part of this community trying to protect the 2024 election, continuing to equip people with information about exactly what this process entails. I think it's fair for people to get confused because some of these processes are really complicated, as some of the answers have already highlighted today. And so anything that we can do to ensure that people have an understanding that, look, if there are delays, that's okay. That is part of the process. If there are legal challenges, that's okay. That is part of the process. Like exactly what Professor Persily shared. There are guardrails in place that are going to ensure that the election is administered freely and fairly. And whatever we can do to equip the American people with information of exactly what this process entails, I think we will be better served across the board.
Thank you, Nicole. Katie, I'm going to turn to you. I want to talk about the role of the tech companies from whence you came. Obviously, so much of what we know or what we think we know comes via the feeds on our social media platforms or our messaging services or what have you. We have seen a lot of change in the last 4 years towards content moderation policy, sort of a pulling back from what was a fairly, in my mind, appropriately aggressive stance, particularly as the 2020 results were being challenged. It's a quite different picture today. What do you see? What is happening with the major platforms in terms of safeguarding the spread of false information? And what more do you think needs to be done?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think first and foremost, I want to make clear that there are teams at these companies continuing to do this work. Being a trust and safety worker is not an easy task in any stretch of the imagination. And so while there have been a lot of headlines about pulling back, it doesn't mean that they're doing nothing. There's quite a bit that they are doing. And I think first and foremost, that is going to be I'm already seeing some of them doing this, reminding people when election day is, that they can early vote, how to find that information about where, when, and how to vote. I think, one challenge that we're also going to see is a lot of these companies, this is their first major election that they're having to actually go through this. I'm thinking of your TikToks, your Twitches, platforms like that. X is just a totally different platform today than what it was in 2020. And so we know that they've done a lot to be prepared, but we don't yet know how they'll make decisions in real-time moments while they are actually happening. I think another area where we will and want to see more from tech companies is when there is those threats and harassments to election officials, particularly if it's giving personal information about them, around taking quick action around many of those types of things. But we have seen, due to particularly Republican pressure, we are seeing companies being less likely to just take down content. They might reduce the reach of it, but you have, again, they're stuck between this rock and a hard place of oftentimes it's folks on the left who want them to do more, and there's folks on the right who want them to do less. And with an election as close as this one is, we're seeing a lot of them kind of not taking as much aggressive action as they did before. And it's unclear how that will play out here in this post-election timeframe when we're going to have periods. There's the process of it, and we know what the process is and how that should go out. But there will be confusion about, we won't know who the winner is. We may not know all of the facts right away. And so that is the time period when not only the tech companies will be in a difficult position about what to do around some of this content, but I think all of us as consumers of information need to realize we have agency in this too, of making sure we understand that as information is coming in, of even re-verifying it, getting multiple sources, understanding that there will be some of this confusion that is happening. And then the tech companies are probably going to have to make some tough decisions about what it is that they allow up or not, particularly if it's coming directly from a candidate.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see this year whether, there was aggressive action when against Trump in 2020. It's hard to imagine that will play out in the same way in the event that he makes claims without evidence.
I think the big thing to remember about 2020 and what ultimately led the platforms to take him off is violence was happening in the moment.
Yeah.
So it wasn't enough that he was making claims that he won. That was not getting him taken off even in 2020. It was when people started storming the Capitol and what he was saying and how he was encouraging them. And I think that if we get to that situation again, the platforms may be under pressure for him to be kicked off, but he's got his own platform now. He's got Truth Social. He does most of his posting there, and that still gets picked up in many other places. And so I don't know how much impact even deplatforming him by the other platforms might have.
Yeah. Nate, I'm going to come back to you. Talk about, there's sometimes I hear, asking for a recount or triggers for a recount are a normal part of the democratic process. I think for some, those imply that there's something amiss. So talk about a little bit about recounts and how those work. And also, what are the legal, somewhat related question, what remedies do election officials have in the face of threats of violence or other forms of aggression in terms of being able to carry out their duties?
So a recount, as you said, is a normal part of the process, and we should expect that there will be some recounts in this election, just as there are in all elections. Whether it's for president, it's too soon to tell. But given that we're running thousands of elections this year, there will be some that are so close that they'll lead to recounts. And so the process is, after the certification of the election, you ask for a recount to. Or in the process of sort of a controversy, you ask for a recount. So in some states, it requires there's an automatic recount if the margin is 0.5%, or sometimes it specifies a certain number of votes, and then there's a specific process in the law for contesting the election, and then once the recounts is concluded, then people could go into court, as we saw, say in Florida in the 2000 election, to say, well, the recount that the counted votes for somehow didn't reflect what was the true totals for each candidate. And your second question was, say that again.
The second question was legal protections for elections.
Violence.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are specific rules related to, say, conduct in polling places and sometimes heightened penalties for violence against election officials. But this is a law enforcement problem, and each one of the local authorities has relationships with law enforcement that have already been solidified in coming up to this election, whether it's to prevent against voter intimidation and violence in polling places, or to make sure that the counting facilities and the sort of central facilities where the election officials are housed as they're looking at the ballots, that those are protected. And so it's of course the nightmare scenario, but they are trying to work with local law enforcement to do that. The DOJ has limited authority. Department of Justice has limited authority if things get out of control, but there's the possibility that they could be drawn into this. But for the most part, you're working with the local police, local law enforcement.
Yeah, great, thanks. Kim, let me come back to you, and I'm starting to weave in questions from the audience. You can continue to drop your questions in the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Two questions for you, Kim. What generally are states doing to reassure the public? What transparency measures are they taking? Anything new this year that hasn't been in the case before? And to make the voters feel like their votes are being counted and that the results will be the will of the people.
I'm not sure that much of this is new. In some states, it might be new, but I think transparency is really one of the pillars of a solid election, and that election officials really embrace, because they want people to believe that the processes are accurately reflecting the way eligible voters cast their ballots, and those results reflect that. So things like ballot tracking systems that states have put into place, not all yet, but I think most, where a voter can put their ballot back into the USPS or into a ballot drop box, and then they can actually track that ballot right up until the moment that their signature has been verified and the ballot has been accepted for tabulation. And I know that that's really the point of showing voters that, see, your ballot did go through the process and it is going to be counted the way you cast it. Then also having observation. It sounds really simple, but this is a basic tenet of elections, is having observers in polling places. I realize in the last 4 years that's been politicized a bit, but that's been something that's been available to political parties for decades in most states, if not all. Having teams of bipartisan workers. So the poll workers, when you walk into that early voting center or into that polling place, are representing Democrats and Republicans. And there's different ways that states do that. But all of these measures are for transparency to the public, to show that we're not going back and opening this ballot box in the dark of night and adding in or taking out ballots. All of the reconciliation, I'm trying to remember which speaker before me mentioned it, but the reconciliation of ballots is another piece of that. Also observable. So all of those elements of an election are observable and transparent. There are some things like the code that the tabulation system may use to tabulate is not shared with the public, and that's a security measure to make sure that we don't have somebody getting in there and trying to hack into it. But I think I got your question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kim. Gowri, I'm going to turn to you. We're getting quite a few questions about the role of AI in these elections. So talk to us a little bit about where AI enabled created content is what we're talking about here, has shown up and where it's not shown up.
So I think it has not shown up in sort of massive quantities the way I think some people predicted. But one thing I want to remind listeners of is that after the 2016 election, it took a couple years for the public to find out about attempts at interference in the security of election systems, attempts to, and sometimes successful attempts to remove copy data from voter registration databases. It took until about 2018 for the public to really have any clue about that. So it is possible that we will find out in the years to come that there was some kind of AI-enabled cyber attack on an election office. One of the things that we at the Brennan Center have warned about is that AI-generated content might just be more sophisticated and convincing to an election staffer. So they might become the victim of a spear phishing attack where they accidentally give away their password to their computer because they got really convinced by that spear phishing attack. We won't know if that happened for a while, probably. The good news, though, is that the same kinds of things that election officials have been doing over the past, 8 years, really 12 years, to protect against non-AI enabled cyber attacks, those work for AI enabled cyber attacks. So using multi-factor authentication, reminding people that they all have to have different usernames and passwords, right? Doing all of that protects against that. And this is one of the areas where having our election system be so decentralized and dispersed is really helpful, right? There's not like one person sitting at the Department of Homeland Security who, if they get spearphished successfully, suddenly our election falls apart and everything is hacked, right? All these machines are, distributed all over the country. They're not connected to the internet. So all that decentralization means that, even if there is some successful attack like that, the impact of it is going to be really limited. The other thing we've seen is that there have been some, in recent weeks, actually, there have been some deep fakes of candidates. So for instance, there is a deep fake video of vice presidential candidate Tim Walz, sort of depicting him engaging in inappropriate behavior with a student. It's completely fake. This never happened. It is totally false. There has been some circulation of that video. There was also appears to be a manipulated video showing workers in Pennsylvania ripping up ballots. That didn't happen. Nobody did that. Very quickly, when election officials in Pennsylvania got wind of that, they put out the truthful information. They pushed back on that rumor to let the public know that that is fake, that video. So we have seen some, attempts like that here and there. And all that work that Secretary Wyman was describing, where election officials are being really transparent, really doing all this active, proactive communication. I believe Nicole mentioned some of this as well. All of that is kind of is working well, I think, in response to those kinds of attacks.
Thanks, Gowri. I want to turn to you on this question too, Nate, and I don't know also if you can address sort of the nation state adversary element of this as well.
Right. So I like Gowri's response on that because it was not limited to the normal way that we think of the effect of AI on elections, since most of the time when we talk about AI and elections, we think about the disinformation problem and limited to, synthetic imagery and all that. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of examples right now of synthetic imagery related to the election. The fact that that it hasn't reached the level of virality that where we would say, all right, this is a problem, is I think what's significant. And so the mere fact that there is all this stuff out there is never really the metric. The question is whether it's hitting the right voters or hitting the right people. Most of what we see with respect to AI generated imagery right now is kind of like satirical, pictures of Trump hugging cats and ducks and things like that. And those kinds of, and it's not really intended to deceive so much as it is to try to push a narrative of, in that case, what was happening in Ohio or something else. And so there is always the chance that there could be an October surprise that could reach a certain level of virality. But for the reasons that Katie was talking about the fracturing of the social media universe, there's less reason to think that convincible voters will be hit with persuadable deep fakes in the next week and a half that will flip the election, because it's not as if this stuff happens in a vacuum where you don't have counter speech or the kinds of responses that Gowri was talking about. So that's the first thing. But I do like the point about cyber attacks. And it's sort of like the cyber attack issue is like, we can call that an AI issue, or we can call it a cybersecurity issue, whatever it is. You're always concerned about that. And maybe there are, sort of less sophisticated actors who now can take advantage of AI in order to launch certain types of attacks. One thing I would emphasize that 100% of the ballots in the battleground states will be cast on paper. And 98% of the ballots nationwide will be. So so the kind of, whether it's AI or other kinds of cyber attacks that then are directed at the actual ballot casting process, I think will fail. There are, however, possibilities of soft targets in the kind of election administration ecosystem. And this ties into your concern about perceptions before, which is that something like the election night reporting system, which is basically, a system, it's basically a system of websites where precincts are reporting to state officials and up and down. You could easily see someone taking down a website, trying to mess with numbers, and then leading to change perceptions that will feed conspiracy theories. And so, those are, I think, legitimate concerns. But, I think the experience with elections over the last year is that people are becoming better at sussing out what's false. They're becoming worse at determining what's true. And for the kind of long-term health of the democracy, that is a bigger danger. But it's not one that I think will lead to deception in terms of deepfakes in this election.
It's interesting what you're saying, but so much of the theme of what all of our really wonderful panelists have been saying over the course of the last hour is expressing confidence that the rightful winner will prevail, but concern about the kind of the noise in the system and the chaos that can happen along the way. As we're winding down towards the end of our webinar, I want to just revisit where we started. I want to come back to those 5 moments and just touch on those again, because I think we cannot talk about these enough. There's just so much focus on election night, Inauguration Day, and now, as of 4 years ago, January 6th. So, Katie, I'm gonna pull you back up, and let's just go through those greatest hits again. Moment
Yes.
1, election night.
Well, I would even say now through the
Okay.
week after the election. So there's kind of a 2-week period here, that 2.5-ish week period of here, that'll be one of the first kind of moments of the highest threat period that we're going to see. Moment 2 is going to be December 11th, and that's that new deadline again when the states have to issue that certificate of ascertainment. And then that week between December 11th and December 17th, when the state electors actually meet in their state capitals to cast their ballots, that's just a heightened time period where we could see protests get mobilized, people showing up at state capitals, potentially many January 6th, in many of those places rather than just here in DC. January 6th is the 4th date. That is when Congress will actually convene and needs to count those ballots. In addition to the new Congress coming in on January 3rd, we need to remember too, on December 20th, Congress runs out of money. We also are likely looking at a very close House race or House races that we may not even know which party is going to be running the House of Representatives when this comes. So we're so focused on the presidential. I want to remind people there's many down ballot races that we also need to be very much paying attention to that could impact this process. And then finally, we do have Inauguration Day, and I would say it would be the days leading up to and also the days after. Because remember, we did have that big women's march the day after the inauguration in 2017. And so we are encouraging everybody you need to stay nimble a little bit and see where things are happening. But it's definitely not like once noon on the 20th is done and they've sworn in, keep an eye out on things for a couple of days after.
Yeah. Many people that I talk to really have focused on, it's probably the least sort of popularized, but that the real critical date is that December 17th date when the state's electors meet and choose their candidate. So December 17th, everybody. And then maybe we get a little bit of a Christmas holiday in between. We'll see.
Don't jinx it, Vivian.
I know. Nobody I know is actually planning very serious vacations for that time for a good reason. And with that, we are just about running out of time now. So I want to just thank all our wonderful panelists who put in so much important work and will be all over all of these issues from now through January 20th and beyond. Katie Harbath, Nicole Schneidman, Gowri Ramachandran, Kim Wyman, and Nate Persily. Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for your attention. And we'll see you next time.